I've been on soft money since 1993. So I understand the difficulties of that. Reporting is a pain, and reporting again and again and again is a pain, but it's so essential to moving this work forward. And lastly, I want to remind us that this amazing place that is Michigan is our life support system, the natural areas that occur there. So I have some objectives. I'm hoping that you can explain why you coordinate invasive species management in your region to all kinds of people. I hope that you will seek out and learn about the ecosystems that are in your region to understand them better and therefore be able to manage invasives better. I hope that you will continue to use the invasion curve to help you make deliberate decisions about what you can and cannot do based upon important factors such as feasibility and funding. I hope to see the Misc data used increasingly more to inform our work. And lastly, again, I hope that you will continue to share your love for the amazing native ecosystems with others. And I started my very first talk thinking about what makes people do good work and protect the things, our natural systems. I've discovered, and I know this because it happened to me, that people protect what they know and love. If they don't know about something, why would they even think about protecting it? If they don't really love and understand it, then perhaps they won't be motivated to do that. And I like to use the piping plover as an example of how when there is a will, there is a way to do some really amazing things. And that's what happened to me. I was a botanist wandering around. I just loved to identify plants. And I would ask people what they were, and they wouldn't know them unless they were in flower. So I just started going about learning them. And I ended up landing at Michigan Natural Features Inventory doing biodiversity conservation. Wasn't in my plan, but that's where I ended up. We track a bunch of rare plants, rare animals, and a lot of natural communities. This is what we look like. This is probably about 4 years ago. Most of the staff that are there now, a couple have moved on. This is an amazing group of people. I encourage you to get to know them. Again, remember, we are soft money funded, so time is important when you're trying to work with us, and we'd love to partner with you all. So now imagine for a minute that you were in charge of protecting Michigan's biodiversity. How would you go about that? Unfortunately, since we are not in the same room looking at one another, I'm just going to move on and instead of having folks answer that. But somebody back in the day when MNFI got started, which was an outcome of the Nature Conservancy, was to build a map of the least disturbed places. Let's go to the places that have not been disturbed and try to learn from them. And so if you lived in southern Michigan and you were the person with that bright idea, you might look around you and say, well, how the heck do I know what was here before it was widely disturbed? Many of you probably know that when the state was settled, general land surveyors were conducted at every square mile of the state, almost every square mile, as we developed the township with 36 square mile sections. They marked the trees at each corner and other data, and then they also described what they saw. So we went through a bunch of different interns and various people that worked over a 6-year period, and they sat in the state historical library, and they went through these records and painstakingly translated them into actual vegetation cover at the time that they were taken. And so if you haven't seen our map, here it is. This is Michigan circa 1800. And it's no longer referred to as pre-settlement map because the state was settled well before the 1800s, but it's a time period when widespread disturbance of the landscape was just beginning. And as you can see, there are patterns across the landscape. You can actually see recognizable things. And those are actually the basis for different community types that occur. So what occurs down here in the southern Michigan, for example, this is the inner lobate region here where we have savannas and prairies and oak hickory forest. We have a lot of wet prairies up here in Saginaw Bay, and on and on and on, all the way up to the boreal forests and conifer swamps in the western UP. And I guess my point is it's not just a random assortment. I know there's a lot of thought going on with regard to climate change, but we do have some things that will be on the landscape for a long time. And so maybe climate change impacts will not be as fast as we think, but this is a fascinating aspect of our work, which I'm going to leave up to Sean and Chris Hoving to talk about later. So the patterns that we see are based upon what the glaciers left behind: moraines, outwash, lake plains, ice contact features. So these are the landforms that were left after the glaciers. These form the basis for the soil types that were there, and in combination with climate, where things are located, the hydrology, and the different natural processes, and by that I mean things like fire, storms, wind, insect outbreaks. These all determine the specific natural community types that occur in a particular place. And plants grow and ecosystems develop where they do because of these factors. Now, obviously, things will change over time, but these systems have been in place for a long time and are still perceptible on much of our landscape. And this is it. This is Michigan. Take a moment to look at the diversity of the systems here that we have to enjoy. We're fortunate to have a lot of state public land, and it's basically remarkable. And when we made the map, one of the reasons we did that was to try to identify all the different types of what we call natural communities and use this as our coarse filter for protecting biodiversity, trying to protect a suite of all of these different ecosystems in multiple numbers will help us conserve a lot of species that live in those ecosystems. And just to remind you of what we mean by a natural community, these are the groups of organisms and their environment under similar natural conditions, and they're predominantly structured by natural processes rather than anthropogenic. And we believe that we can learn a lot about sustaining ecosystems by understanding these ones that have been here for so long. If you're interested, we have a beautiful field guide that goes through those and gives you examples of places to visit them. And we also have some more detailed abstracts on our website. Sometimes species fall through the cracks. And our second component, in addition to natural community filter or the coarse filter, is the fine filter. And these are the vulnerable species, the listed and, the threatened and endangered and special concern species that are decreasing in numbers across the landscape. So we try to capture representations that have all of these different elements as well. And then there's a third component that I think you're all aware of or should be aware of by now, and that is genetic diversity. And why is genetic diversity so important? It provides the raw material that enables organisms to adapt to new conditions, and therefore enabling ecosystems to persist more easily. So we don't just do this randomly. We try to think about, these are categories now that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service uses when they're looking at whether something has been recovered or not. Resiliency. This comes with genetic diversity. So when stochastic events occur, if you have enough genetic diversity, you can recover. Representation. Cover the entire range of the community or the species, because the conditions, although they're similar, they're not exactly the same everywhere. And then finally, redundancy. We need to capture enough of those occurrences that if we have catastrophic events, we'll sustain them. So I want to, everything I put on in yellow here are things that are kind of new sort of revelations to me over the last 2 years and thinking about things with this crazy world we have. it's not just the big reserves that is important, it's the small places and their connectivity as well. You can build a pollinator garden in your yard, which will be critical to advancing and sustaining pollinators over time, for example. And I want to mention that I'm not saying that things will not change. This is obviously not static, and there will be change, and there is change, and some of it will be transformational. But I'm going to leave this to Chris and Sean to talk about later today. So I want to emphasize also that protecting biodiversity is not a numbers game. It's not about how many, and I mean, it is somewhat about that, but most importantly, it's about the relationships that connect all of our species together. It's a fine web that has connections that are really critical, and as we break those and take pieces out, it becomes less resilient. So keep all the parts is a good adage to keep in mind when you're thinking about what's going on in your area. Try to find those places that are still intact, and let's keep them. And what this does then is provides resiliency to change. And as we know, change is constant. And why? Because the diverse functional ecosystems sustain life on Earth. They literally sustain us. And that has become more evident over the last 2 years than I could ever imagine. And the second thing is that I've become even more aware of how finite our resources are. We act as if we can do whatever we want, and there will always be what we need to keep going, and that's simply not true. We have ecosystem services and lots of different things: food, medicines, purifying the water, detoxifying soils, spiritual needs, pollination and nutrient cycling. All of these things require diverse functional ecosystems in order to sustain our lives. And my message is, I believe they say, at least today, that simplified ecosystems are more vulnerable to changing conditions and catastrophic events. If you have less diversity and you have a catastrophe, it's just more likely that things will go awry when there's not other things to take their place. And invasive species, of course, simplify ecosystems, as can be seen from these pictures here. And invasive species are eroding our native biodiversity at a seemingly rapid pace. And they're degrading terrestrial and aquatic systems. There's a lot of emotion that goes into talking about invasive species. And I just remembered the very first talk, one of the very first talks I ever gave, I put up water hyacinth and water lettuce as something to be concerned about in Michigan, even though we had no proof of overwintering. And I was called out in the crowd and said that I was being irresponsible by calling these species of concern in Michigan. I wasn't saying that they are in Michigan. I was saying that I recognize these are amazingly expensive management problems in the southern part of the state. We know that already. Let's not let them get to Michigan. And as we know, now we are finding these in our waters. We're still not sure if they're overwintering, but certainly if climate changes warming changes, these species may actually be able to take off. So invasive species disrupt the connections between the biotic and abiotic factors that allow our native ecosystems to thrive. I heard another quote, I'd not heard this before, which I really like. They're making holes in the fabric of life. And we only see the big things when we look at an ecosystem. And as E.O. Wilson has said, it's the little things that really govern the world. So the microorganisms and all those things, nutrients and chemicals in the soil and all those things, all of it is necessary to sustain our ecosystems. And learning to understand those as best we can is our job. So our ecosystems are our life support system. But what I've come to realize is that many people do not know or are too busy to remember this or understand it. Not because they're evil. I suppose there may be some evil people out there, but it's because of the circumstances of their lives that haven't enabled them to be exposed to certain things. They're too busy trying to feed their family, or too busy just moving as life has been always. And if you don't know something, why on earth would you even think of trying to protect it? So I think one of the biggest jobs for SISMA coordinators is in education. And I'm extremely proud of the work that you all have been doing in bringing this more into the mainstream. It does make a difference, the words we use and the ways we do it, the education. And I don't know if there's a session later that talks about this. It's a whole nother workshop. But anyway, it's a big part of what we have to do. And I would add that I think that keeping as much of what we have intact is our best bet at every scale. And again, I'm not suggesting that there will be no change. And hopefully Chris and Sean will be able to shine some more light on the kinds of changes we might see. So since we can't talk about a lot about how to educate people, I just wanted to throw this question out there because I see this misunderstanding over and over and over again. And I think there's one thing that we all need to emphasize is what we call invasive species. So which ones of these are invasive? These all mean the same. They have been introduced to new areas on purpose or by accident, sometimes by natural means. But only some of them could become invasive, and the ones that do are the ones that cause harm to something we value. So when you start using these words instead of invasive, it's very confusing to people and it sparks a lot of emotion. So this is one example of how important the words we use are in moving this work forward. You can talk for hours and weeks and years, and if you don't agree on what an invasive species is, you're going to get nowhere. And yes, ecosystems are intertwined with social and economic resiliency as well. We can have environmental resiliency without the other two, but where would life be then? So they're inextricably linked, and we need all three of them to, at least as much as I know about the world today, we need all three to thrive. And if you add that complication, all the threats that we already know have been occurring across the landscape, and you add invasive species and climate change to it, it brings up, of course, the chicken with its head cut off. And a confession. I still ask myself this every single day. Should we be managing invasive species? And I still think the answer is yes. But it is hard to turn a big ship around. No pun intended. And there is hope. Through all we've experienced in the last couple of years in particular, I've seen silver linings in how people have responded everywhere I go. And I see optimism, and I see creativity, and I am ever hopeful that we can do a better job sustaining the finite resources on Earth. So you've all seen this picture before, the invasion curve, where we want to try to prevent species from arriving. If they've gotten here and we detect them early enough, we can save a lot of time and headache managing them right away. And if we wait until they get down to the end of the curve, it's a much more difficult situation in terms of deciding what to do. So I always go back to this. I haven't seen anything much better or more novel, but hopefully other people can chime in if they know of other things. But what I want to emphasize is that in order to use this curve to inform your decision making, we need to have some basic information. And this is what I want you to feel so proud about. When I started working on invasive species, there were no invasive species lists, or if they were, everybody argued about them. There was no effective reporting system, even though they exist. People didn't know how to use them. They were complicated. There were no maps of invasive species. How can you manage something when you don't know where it is? I was, in my early years with MNFI, not allowed to talk about autumn olive as an invasive species. And for those of you who may still believe it's not an invasive species, just visit a place where it has been invaded and you might change your mind. There were no staff in Wildlife Division dedicated to invasive species work. There are few groups like the SISMAs that we have today. There was no Michigan Invasive Species Coalition or the Michigan Invasive Species Grant Program, two really critical components in moving our work forward. There was no core team refining the MISGP priorities. There were no signs about invasive species on highways that you can find today. There was no Go Beyond Beauty. These are just examples of the slate we didn't have in order to use the invasion curve to make decisions. And you all have played an incredible role in turning the corner from this spot. We have SISMA coverage throughout the entire state that involve interjurisdictional partnerships working together for a common goal. And I've seen the dedication of the people who are the coordinators. It's tremendous. Everybody does it a little bit differently with their different skill sets, but it's changed how we think about invasive species and how successful we can be. And I believe they will continue to do so. And I want to shout out to the team members, the Michigan Invasive Species Coalition team members and the core teams that support the SISMAs. You are simply amazing. These have become household words in a lot of places. I think this is still in place. The Great Lakes Detector of Invasive Aquatics in Trade, mining the web to try to find where things are being illegally traded. Risk assessments, you've probably all done or been involved with some of these as well. We've learned about the power of mapping. This was the first mapping effort I ever did, mapping spotted knapweed at Camp Grayling, northeast of Grayling. And we learned about how we can identify outliers, pathways, which here are clearly the roads, and source populations. When you overlay that with a priority place, it gives you a template from which to make decisions now. We've learned about the goal of invasive species management, that it's to stop the arrival and establishment of invasive species. And if it does establish and start to reproduce, to stop the reproduction and dispersal. We've learned that, therefore, we must understand the dispersal vectors and the biology of the invader. And I would add that we now must take a closer look at the systems we are working in too, as this will give us many ideas about the best way to manage species in different systems. There's different points where invasives can be introduced into a system, and it depends upon the system a lot in terms of how the invasion occurs. We've learned that just because something looks dead, it doesn't mean it is. Nobody in this group here is gonna treat Japanese knotweed like this, which has created thousands of propagules to re-establish that population and for vehicles to take and spread down the road. We know that there's a root that's really, really hard to kill underground, and if we don't kill it, we have not succeeded. And we know that little fragments can make new plants. And there are real impacts to this species. If you are one of those people that finds it hard to believe that we are actually treating Japanese knotweed in little places all over the state, I encourage you to take a trip out east, take a look at what's going on there, and think about the impacts if we don't treat this. We have a window of time. It's the irony of invasive species work. There's a window of time in which we can be effective, and if we wait to know every single thing there is about a species, that window will pass us by. Ditto for Phragmites. 80% of this plant is underground. If you don't kill the root, the plant will continue to thrive. We have made critical progress in the northern part of the state, across the entire UP, doing early detection and response for this species, and other places in northern lower. There's lots of great efforts going on. It's a little bit more challenging down in the southern part of the state, but we are making progress. There's a whole collaborative dealing just with this species. We've learned that there is no silver bullet or one right answer. It depends upon what are the best techniques at each site, because it's unique based upon the biology, the site conditions, the weather conditions, and we all know that follow-up is necessary. We've been working with MDOT and county road commissioners to help stop the spread along roads. We now have projects, MNFI now has projects where we're actually surveying roads prior to new construction. And believe me, these are serving as really, really strong vectors. It's tricky to figure out how to manage them because the plants have different management needs, but we will continue to work on this, as I think is such a critical source, moving things around the state. And we've learned that with good planning and research on integrated control strategies, success is indeed possible. This is a pre-picture. This is after treatment and the following spring. Now we all know that Phragmites is not gone, but when we reduce it to a level that we can maintain, the cost of maintaining it are dramatically lower than continuing to deal with these large populations. We understand there are real impacts that aren't necessarily obvious. Here's the black swallowwort that tricks the monarch into depositing their eggs on it because it's in the same family as the milkweed, but it comes out earlier. The larvae suffer higher mortality because it's toxic to them. We've learned that following this same theme that many non-native plants are toxic to a lot of our native insect specialists. And there's the work that Douglas Ptolemy has catapulted a lot of people into planting native species. Baby birds are very particular about what they eat. The mothers have to go hundreds of trips a day to bring back the very specific insect for their babies to grow up. When we replace our native species with those that don't support them, we chip away at their food source. And this, of course, then chips away at the whole food web. We understand, I hope, that invasive species are not inherently evil. I have a plant-centric view. You've probably figured that out already, so I sometimes forget about the animals. But in the case of plants, when they arrive in a new place, they just try to do what they've always done, grow and reproduce like most organisms do. It's just that they're in a new environment where some of them can eventually dominate and invade. So that's a quick pat on the back for all the work that you have helped to accomplish and learn over these years that we've been working on invasive species together. I have some observations from my own experience and just watching the work that people do. One of the top ones is to toss your ego and focus on the end goal. I've seen a lot of squabbles and fights where if you would just let go and put your attention on what we're trying to accomplish, progress can be made. I think there needs to be a bigger focus on causes, not just the symptoms of invasions. A good example is Phragmites and European frogbit in Saginaw Bay. We know that Phragmites will outcompete native species in high nutrient environments. There's pretty convincing evidence of that. So if we don't change the high nutrient level, we are treating a symptom, then we'll be treating it and treating it and treating it. So we can learn from focus on causes for all our invasions a little bit more. Don't reinvent the wheel. Try to make it roll better. I think this is something that we've done very well. People always want to just used to want to pick up the spray can and go out when they first learned about a plant. There's an abundant amount of information about the species that we work with, and learning from others who've worked with them makes sense. And I see that happening all over the place. I encourage you to value your own observations and knowledge. You are the front line in the field. You'll see things that people sitting in an office or a lab may not observe. We need to let them know what information you need to help make better decisions. We can't do it all. It's every little step in the right direction counts, as long as you document and learn from it. Restoration is taking off in this all over the place. And I just wanted to remind you that when you wipe the slate clean in restorations, i.e. you start from scratch, you are erasing years of evolutionary history. And that evolutionary history will not come back quickly, I don't believe. So I encourage you to, in places where we still have intact systems, enhance them, restore them, but don't wipe the slate clean. There are places where we will have to wipe the slate clean because there's nothing left there to manage, but just bear in mind, we don't know as much as evolutionary history does. I also know that showing success is the best way to get more dollars. And believe me, I feel your pain as SYSMA coordinators in having to compete for funds every single year for everything that we do. Ironically, in a way, I think it's helped us focus and our work and onto the most important things. Sometimes when you have money just all over the place, things get sort of diluted, and we have a teams in place that have really shown incredible leadership in trying to focus our work on the most important things. And then finally, I would like to say, I think we need to step back and rebalance our portfolio's actions frequently, just like we do with our bank accounts. We get new information every day, new ideas. No one person knows it all. So building teams with diverse skills is really critical to changing things that we may learn there are better ways to do. So I encourage you to read. I encourage you to listen, and I mean really listen. I encourage you to talk. I encourage you to envision, create, innovate, and document what you do. You all out there have done incredible work, and I think you have a lot more incredible work to contribute to how we can sustain life on Earth. Kevin, how am I doing for time?
This is your official 5-minute warning, Phyllis. 5 minutes.
Perfect, because I had to have a pop quiz in there. So just a couple of species that if you're not aware of already, here's an herbaceous annual vine. Triangular leaf, very distinct. Purple flower or fruits. It looks benign, but you try to pull this out and you will be bleeding shortly thereafter. You can recognize it in the winter, which may be a good time to survey for it. We've got our first occurrences occurring in the southern part of the state. And when we surveyed these fruits, even though it was already, I think it was September or October, these were still fully viable, or at least they certainly looked like it inside there. This is a Myla minute-weed. It's one of our watch list species. And here's its distribution. Next one. You probably all have heard of this, may not recognize it right away, but it does have opposite leaves. This is black swallowwort. The leaves are opposite entire, and they have winged seeds in a pod, just like other species in the milkweed family. There's actually two species. There's a pale and a black. Both are in the state. Black is believed to be more common. It shows up in places you might not think about. Here's what happens when it takes over. And there's what you have to deal with. This has been notoriously difficult to control. And why am I bringing this up? It's not widespread around the state. And I, this year, did surveys along I-75 in Oakland County. This is all swallowwort. So it's traveling north, and early detection is imperative. And there's this distribution. This is probably an underrepresentation for sure. Next one. This one, you all probably know this one. It's a woody vine. I'm bringing this one up again because it's traveling along the corridors of our highways. This is Oriental bittersweet. Strangles trees, kills them. Very distinctive fruits with a bright red and orangish, I forget what these are called. Just call them bracts for now. Arrows, I think they are. This is the kind of damage that can be done. There is a native where the fruits are out front, showy, and the ones for the non-native are axillary down through the stem. Here's its distribution, and you can see there's a large part of Michigan that theoretically does not have it yet, but it's coming. Early detection is critical, and we already know good controls for this species. This is an aquatic submergent perennial. It's one of our watch list species. This is, of course, hydrilla. Whorls of 4 to 8 leaves, not the 3 that Eladia or the common aquarium plant has. It kind of keeps its shape when it's out of water, and the two margins are toothed. Keep an eye out for this. It's the perfect weed. Not in Michigan yet, as far as I know. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but you can see it's creeping closer. I think this is the last one. Anybody know this one? It's another watch list species. I've never seen it personally. This is water soldier, also called the pineapple plant. It kind of looks like the tufts of a pineapple plant. For each rosette, the leaves stick up, but it has these very sharp spines along the edges of the leaves, so you won't mistake it for anything else. It's kind of cool because it rises and becomes buoyant in the spring, in the growing season, and it sinks after that. So a really interesting life cycle. Here's an invasion of what this can look like. And it's not in Michigan yet, but it's not too far. This is where European frogbit came from, over in this region, and we've got that. And I want to leave you with a few slides to remind us this is Michigan. These are our diverse ecosystems. And controlling invasive species is not about killing even plants. It's about protecting important ecosystems and processes. I encourage you to embrace the places where you are and learn to know them well. We must not take these assets for granted. We have movement going north more and more and more, and we need to ensure that the ecosystems that we have protected thus far remain so. And again, people protect what they know and love. Share your experiences with others so they can come to love them, and in that way, they will help support our work. And the sum is truly greater than its parts. So all of us working together can make a bigger difference than individuals working alone. And all of our ecosystems together provide tremendous life support. And with that, I'll end. And I thank you again. It's been a true joy working with all of you, and I wish you all the best in the future.